Would you welcome a guest and slam the door in their face? That was the unspoken question haunting the United States in the early 1960s. An era when African diplomats were routinely insulted, denied service, and racially profiled on American soil, despite being guests of honor invited by the U.S. government itself. The mistreatment of African diplomats under Jim Crow laws became an international scandal and forced America to confront its own hypocrisy. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Give this video a thumbs up and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss when I drop a new one. Alright, let's continue. In April 1961, William Fitzjohn, Sierra Leone's charge d'affaires, was en route to an important meeting at the White House. Along with his driver, he made a routine stop to grab lunch along Route 40 in Maryland. Unbeknownst to him, he was walking into a storm of American racial politics. They pulled into a Howard Johnson's restaurant in Hagerstown, Maryland, assuming that a well-known chain would welcome all customers. Instead, Fitzjohn was refused service. He showed his diplomatic credentials. He explained his mission. It didn't matter. The waitress still said no. Fitzjohn later told the Associated Press that the experience was very emotionally upsetting. What seemed like a routine act of racial discrimination to many Americans exploded into an international incident. The Sierra Leonean diplomat's treatment made headlines around the world, prompting apologies from the White House and angry condemnations from African leaders. The Soviet Union seized on the moment, using it as Cold War propaganda to point out the hypocrisy of America's claims to freedom and democracy. This wasn't an isolated event. During the 1950s and 1960s, black diplomats from newly independent African nations were frequently subjected to the same segregation and humiliation that African Americans experienced daily. The difference? These diplomats were foreign representatives of sovereign nations, many of which the U.S. was trying to court during the Cold War. Their mistreatment became a massive embarrassment to the Kennedy administration and to America's global image. The issue was not limited to one restaurant. Route 40, stretching from Washington, D.C. to New York City, was a main route used by diplomats traveling to and from the United Nations. Along the way, African diplomats faced humiliation in hotels, restaurants, gas stations, and barbershops. It wasn't uncommon for diplomats to be called racial slurs or denied service. In one instance, an African ambassador was accused of being a domestic servant. Others were told they couldn't be served because they were black. Such treatment deeply offended foreign dignitaries and became a regular source of friction between the U.S. and African governments. In 1960 alone, 17 African nations gained independence. President John F. Kennedy recognized the strategic importance of forming alliances with these nations to counter the influence of the Soviet Union. Yet while Kennedy extended formal diplomatic courtesy, the U.S. public sphere, especially in the South, remained mired in Jim Crow laws. The contradiction between America's diplomatic ambitions and its domestic racism was stark. The United States wanted to be a beacon of democracy and opportunity. Instead, it looked like a nation unwilling to live by the ideals it preached. In an effort to address the growing diplomatic fallout, the State Department established the Special Protocol Service Section, SPSS, under Pedro San Juan. San Juan's mission was clear: protect African and Asian diplomats from racial mistreatment while in the U.S. San Juan soon realized that the issue wasn't a matter of a few rogue businesses. It was systemic. Racism was deeply entrenched. Despite letters, meetings, and pressure, many businesses along Route 40 refused to desegregate. San Juan worked tirelessly to help diplomats find housing, safe travel routes, and avoid confrontation. But there were limits to what protocol could fix. San Juan even appealed to governors, asking them to ensure equal treatment for all foreign guests. Some states complied. Others shrugged him off or resisted outright. One Maryland official suggested putting up signs that read, "Diplomats only," at select restaurants. The idea was ridiculed as tone-deaf and even more discriminatory. African diplomats grew increasingly frustrated. Some threatened to leave the United States. Others brought their grievances before the United Nations. Leaders from countries like Ghana, Nigeria, and Ethiopia made direct complaints. Newspapers in Africa reported these incidents in detail. The Soviet Union delighted in publicizing each episode, painting the U.S. as a hypocritical superpower with little moral authority. These international embarrassments added pressure to a domestic civil rights movement that was already gaining momentum. By the early 1960s, civil rights activists were staging sit-ins, freedom rides, and protests throughout the South. The Freedom Riders in particular were challenging segregated transportation and faced violence and arrest for doing so. The Kennedy administration, reluctant at first to push too hard on civil rights for fear of alienating Southern voters, found itself forced to act. The international scrutiny and Cold War rivalry made inaction impossible. Historian René Romano notes, "The world was watching." To maintain credibility during the Cold War, the U.S. had to start living up to the values it preached. The diplomatic embarrassments helped frame civil rights not just as a moral or legal issue, but as a national security and foreign policy concern. How could America convince African nations to ally with the West when their ambassadors were being refused service at lunch counters? President Kennedy began to speak more publicly about civil rights. In 1963, he gave a nationally televised address calling civil rights a moral issue and introduced legislation that would later become the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a landmark piece of legislation that outlawed segregation in public places and banned employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. It was a major victory for civil rights activists who had fought for years to dismantle Jim Crow. While the movement was powered by the courage and sacrifice of African Americans, the role of diplomatic embarrassment should not be overlooked. The treatment of African diplomats forced white Americans to confront the full absurdity and cruelty of segregation. These were not radicals or protesters, but official representatives of foreign governments. People in suits and ties with credentials and titles. If they could be treated this way, what hope was there for everyday Black Americans? Once the Civil Rights Act was passed, the Special Protocol Service section was disbanded. Its work was no longer necessary, at least officially, but the legacy of its creation and the ugly truths it was meant to mask remained. Today, the story of William Fitzjohn and others like him serves as a reminder of how the fight for civil rights played out not just in courtrooms and on the streets, but also in the quiet corridors of diplomacy. The international stage amplified America's racial injustices and forced the country to take a long, hard look in the mirror. It is a story about hypocrisy, shame, and global scrutiny, but it is also a story of progress. Faced with the prospect of global humiliation, America began to change, not just because it was the right thing to do, but because the world demanded it. As historian Romano puts it, they were treated not as human beings or honored guests, but as Black men. Their experiences reminded the world, and America itself, how far the country still had to go. The mistreatment of African diplomats during the Jim Crow era was more than a series of embarrassing headlines. It was a crack in the facade, a glimpse into the nation's unfinished work, and a surprising catalyst for change that helped tip the balance in one of the most important social justice struggles of the 20th century. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below with your thoughts. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring.